Charleston, South Carolina. March 15th, 1859. Behind the iron gates and Spanish moss of Magnolia House, a secret burns like fire in the shadows. Margaret Beaumont, daughter of cotton and commerce, heir to an empire built on broken backs, sits at her mahogany writing desk with trembling hands. The letter before her carries news that will shatter the pillars of Charleston society. News of a child born in secret, a love forbidden by blood and law, and a truth that could destroy everything her family has built across 3 generations. But Margaret Beaumont is not writing to confess. She is writing to hide. What began as whispered affection in moonlit gardens has become a scandal that threatens to expose the rotting foundation beneath Charleston's most respected dynasty. This is the story of an heiress who dared to love beyond the boundaries of her world, and the price that love demanded from everyone it touched. Before we continue, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is there. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel because stories like this need to be told. The air in Charleston that spring carried the scent of jasmine and something else, something darker. Behind every wrought iron balcony, beneath every polished smile at society gatherings, secrets festered like wounds that refused to heal. The Beaumont name had ruled this corner of the South for 60 years. Cotton fields that stretched beyond the horizon, ships that carried their wealth across oceans, and a mansion that stood like a monument to everything the old world believed was proper and right. But inside those walls, where crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows and servants moved like ghosts through corridors lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, Margaret Beaumont was about to learn that some secrets refused to stay buried. She was 22 that spring, with hair the colour of autumn leaves and eyes that held storms. Not the kind of woman who bent easily to expectations, though she had learned to wear the mask of Southern grace like armour. Her father, Colonel Edmund Beaumont, had built his fortune on the sweat of others and called it Providence. Her mother, Elizabeth, spent her days arranging flowers and pretending that the screams from the quarters were simply the wind through the magnolias. They had raised Margaret to be a perfect Southern belle, a prize to be traded for political connections and business alliances. But Margaret had other ideas. It started, as these things often do, with a glance. Not across a ballroom floor or during a formal introduction, but in the gardens behind the kitchen house where the morning glory vines climbed toward heaven and nobody of importance was supposed to see. His name was Samuel, and he moved through the world with the quiet dignity of a man who had learned early that survival meant becoming invisible. He was maybe 25, with hands that knew both gentleness and strength, and eyes that seemed to hold the weight of too many unspoken words. He tended the gardens, coaxed life from soil, made beauty bloom in places where beauty was not supposed to exist. Margaret first noticed him on a Tuesday in April, when the azaleas were drunk with colour and the air hummed with the possibility of rain. She had escaped the suffocating parlour where her mother was entertaining the wives of Charleston's elite, their voices sharp as broken glass as they dissected the reputations of anyone not present. She walked the garden paths seeking silence, seeking air that didn't taste of judgment and expectation. That's when she saw him, kneeling beside a bed of roses, his fingers gentle as he pruned away the dead to make room for new growth. He looked up as she approached, and something passed between them. Not words, not yet, but recognition. As if 2 souls had found each other across an impossible divide and whispered, finally, someone who sees. She should have turned away, should have returned to the parlour and her predetermined life, should have remembered the laws, the customs, the weight of her family name. Instead, she asked about the roses. Their conversations began like stolen moments. A few words about soil and seasons, about the way morning light caught the petals just so. She would find excuses to walk the gardens, always with a book in hand as if her presence there was accidental. He would glance up from his work, and they would speak of small things, safe things, the weather, The way the mockingbirds sang different songs at different hours, the secret life of growing things. But beneath the surface, something else was growing too. Something dangerous and beautiful and doomed. Spring turned to summer, and their conversations grew longer. She learned that he could read, though teaching slaves to read was forbidden. Learned that he had been born on a plantation in Virginia and sold south when he was 15. Learned that he had a sister somewhere in Georgia, whose face he kept alive in memory because it was all he had left of home. She told him things she had never told anyone. About the loneliness of being raised like a porcelain doll, admired but never truly known. About the books she read in secret, the thoughts she was never allowed to speak, the dreams that had no place in the life planned for her. By August, they were meeting deliberately. Not in the gardens anymore, too risky, too visible, but in the old carriage house behind the stables, where dust motes danced in shafts of golden light, and the air smelled of leather and hay and possibility. She would slip away during the afternoon heat when the house drowsed, and her absence might go unnoticed. He would find reasons to work near the stables, checking harnesses, cleaning tack, waiting for the sound of her footsteps on the wooden floor. It was there, in that sanctuary of shadows and sunbeams, that friendship became something more. There, surrounded by the tools of her family's power, the carriages that carried them to social triumphs built on others' suffering, that she first touched his hand. First felt the calluses earned through years of labour, the strength that came from surviving in a world designed to break him. First understood that love, real love, recognised no boundaries except those drawn by fear. They knew it was impossible, knew that what they felt for each other violated every law written and unwritten, knew that discovery would mean death for him and disgrace for her. But knowledge and feeling are different countries, and the heart recognises no passport but its own truth. She loved the way he spoke her name, not with the deference expected from someone in his position, but with tenderness. Loved the way he listened when she read to him from books of poetry. His eyes focused not just on her words, but on her face, as if memorizing every expression. Loved that with him she could be simply Margaret, not the Beaumont heiress, not a symbol of Southern womanhood, just herself. He loved her courage, the way she questioned everything she had been taught to accept without thought. Loved her laughter, so different from the practiced giggles of the women he served at formal dinners. Loved that she saw him as a man, not property, not a function, but a human being worthy of respect and affection. In her presence, he remembered what it felt like to hope for something beyond mere survival. Their love affair unfolded in stolen hours and whispered conversations, in the sharing of books and dreams and fears, in touches that lasted only seconds, but burned in memory for days. They created their own world in that carriage house, a place where the rules that governed their lives beyond those walls held no power, where they could imagine, just for a moment, that love might be stronger than law, that the human heart might triumph over human cruelty. But summer secrets cannot hide forever from autumn light, and in Charleston, where everyone watched everyone else for signs of scandal or weakness, where every gesture was examined for hidden meaning, where the social order depended on everyone staying precisely in their assigned place, such a love could not remain hidden indefinitely. The signs were small at first. A slave girl who noticed Margaret's frequent walks, a stable boy who saw her entering the carriage house when she thought no one was looking, whispers in the kitchen, glances between servants who knew how to read the subtle changes in their mistress's behaviour. By September, Margaret knew she was carrying Samuel's child. The knowledge hit her like lightning, illuminating everything and destroying everything in the same brilliant flash. She sat in her bedroom, hand pressed to her still flat stomach, and felt the world reshape itself around this new reality. A child born of forbidden love, carrying the blood of both oppressor and oppressed, heir to nothing but shame and danger. She thought of the laws that made such a child an abomination in the eyes of society. Thought of her father's rage, her mother's horror, the whispers that would follow her family name forever. But she also thought of Samuel's hands, so gentle with growing things. Thought of his voice reading poetry in the golden light of afternoon. Thought of the child who would carry pieces of them both, and felt something stronger than fear rise in her chest. Love, yes, but more than that. Defiance. The recognition that some truths are worth whatever price they demand. She told Samuel on a day when rain drummed against the carriage house roof and the air tasted of change through shock, joy. Watched his face cycle, terror, and finally, a kind of fierce protectiveness that made her understand why she had fallen in love with him in the first place. They held each other in the growing darkness, both knowing that their secret had just become exponentially more dangerous, both knowing that there was no path forward that would not demand everything from them. Because in Charleston, in 1859, some loves were not just forbidden, they were punishable by death, and Margaret Beaumont, daughter of privilege, heir to an empire built on the belief that some people were worth more than others, was about to discover what it meant to love someone the world considered worthless. The child growing inside her would force her to choose between the life she had been given and the love she had found, between the safety of silence and the courage to speak truth, no matter the cost. And in that choice, she would learn that some secrets once born demand to be acknowledged, that some loves once kindled refuse to be extinguished, that some truths once spoken can never be taken back. The storm was coming, not just the rain that lashed the windows and bent the trees, but the storm that would tear apart everything Charleston society believed about itself, about bloodlines and boundaries, about who deserved love and who deserved freedom, about what happened when the human heart refused to recognize the cages built to contain it. Margaret pressed her hand to her stomach again, feeling the first flutter of life beneath her palm, and made her choice. October brought whispers that slithered through Charleston's drawing rooms like smoke through cracks in old wood. Margaret felt them even when no one spoke directly to her. The way conversations paused when she entered a room. The way her mother's friends studied her waistline with eyes sharp as pins. The way the household staff moved around her with a different kind of careful attention, as if she were made of glass that might shatter at the wrong word. She had become expert at hiding. Corsets laced tighter each morning, loose-fitting gowns chosen with deliberate care, posture adjusted to conceal what grew beneath layers of silk and secrets. But hiding a pregnancy was like trying to hold water in cupped hands. Eventually, something always spilled through. Samuel watched her with growing desperation during their increasingly rare meetings. The carriage house had become too dangerous. Too many eyes, too much traffic near the stables as autumn brought preparations for the social season. They met now in places that felt like borrowed time. Behind the smokehouse in the hour before dawn, in the shadow of the old oak that stood at the edge of the property where moonlight couldn't reach. Always listening for footsteps, always ready to part as if they were strangers who had simply happened upon the same patch of ground. The child made itself known in ways that terrified and amazed her. A flutter here, a shift there, like secrets trying to surface. She would place her hand over the slight swell of her belly and feel the future pressing against her palm, demanding acknowledgement, demanding space in a world that had no place for it. During family dinners, while her father spoke of cotton prices and her mother discussed the latest fashions from Paris, Margaret would feel the child move and wonder what kind of world she was bringing it into. Because the world of Charleston in 1859 was a world built on the belief that blood told truth. That some bloodlines were pure and others were poison, that mixing them was not just forbidden but unnatural, an offense against God and nature alike. The child growing inside her carried both streams, would be claimed by neither accepted by none. In the eyes of the law, it would be property. In the eyes of society, it would be proof of her family's fall from grace. But in her eyes, in Samuel's eyes, it was simply their child. The living symbol of a love that had grown despite every obstacle, every danger, every reason to turn away. And that difference in perspective would soon tear Charleston apart. The first real threat came from an unexpected source. Viola, the young woman who helped with the laundry and had always seemed devoted to the Beaumont family, began asking questions. Not direct questions, those would have been too dangerous for someone in her position. But careful inquiries wrapped in concern. Was Miss Margaret feeling well? She seemed tired lately. Perhaps she needed different foods, different care. The kind of questions that seemed innocent on the surface, but carried weight beneath. Margaret realized with growing alarm that Viola suspected something. Worse, she realized that Viola's suspicions might not stay private. In a house where information was currency and loyalty could be bought with promises of better treatment or threats of worse, secrets became weapons in the wrong hands. She began to watch Viola watching her, caught her lingering outside doors, noticed her paying attention to which rooms Margaret visited and when, saw her exchanging glances with other household staff, the kind of looks that said knowledge was being shared, evaluated, prepared for use. The net was tightening, and Margaret could feel it drawing closer with each passing day. Samuel sensed the change in her during their brief encounters, saw the fear in her eyes that had nothing to do with their usual caution, and everything to do with discovery looming like storm clouds on the horizon. When she told him about Viola's suspicious behavior, his face went still in the way that meant he was calculating odds, measuring distances, preparing for the worst. They both knew what discovery would mean. For him, death. Not the quick death of a bullet or rope, but the slow, public death designed to serve as example and warning. For her, social death that might be worse than the physical kind. Exile from everything she had ever known, every comfort she had ever enjoyed, every connection that had defined her existence. And for their child, a life of shame and struggle, marked from birth as evidence of transgression. But knowledge of consequences and ability to prevent them are different things entirely. And in Charleston, where every secret eventually found its way to the surface, where every scandal became currency in the endless games of social positioning, their secret was running out of places to hide. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening in late October. Margaret was in her room, reading by lamplight, when she heard her mother's voice in the hallway outside her door. Not the usual refined tones Elizabeth Beaumont used in public, but something sharper, more urgent. Margaret pressed her ear to the door and caught fragments of conversation that made her blood turn cold. Viola's name, suspicions, the need to investigate quietly, the importance of protecting the family name. And beneath it all, the growing certainty that her secret was no longer secret, that the walls she had built around her forbidden love were crumbling like sandcastles at high tide. She waited until the house settled into its nighttime quiet, then slipped from her room and made her way through corridors she had walked since childhood, past portraits of ancestors who stared down with painted eyes that seemed to judge her every step, past rooms filled with furniture bought with money earned through others' labour, past windows that looked out on gardens where she had first fallen in love and sealed her fate. The kitchen house stood separate from the main building, connected by a covered walkway that provided some shelter from rain, but none from watching eyes. Margaret moved through shadows thick as velvet, heart hammering against her ribs with each footfall that seemed too loud in the stillness. She had to reach Samuel, had to warn him that their time was running out faster than autumn leaves in a hurricane. But when she reached the small room behind the kitchen where he slept, she found it empty. Not just unoccupied, but cleaned out. No personal belongings, no sign that anyone had ever lived there at all. Just bare walls and a narrow bed stripped of everything that might have identified its former occupant. Margaret stood in that empty room and felt the world tilt beneath her feet. Samuel was gone. Vanished without warning, without goodbye, without any indication of where or why or whether she would ever see him again. Had he fled because he sensed discovery approaching? Had he been discovered already and taken away in the night? Had her father learned the truth and dealt with the problem in the quiet, permanent way that such problems were usually handled? She pressed her hands to her belly, feeling the child move restlessly, as if sensing her distress, and realized she was truly alone now. The man she loved had disappeared into the darkness that swallowed so many who dared to step outside their assigned places. The child they had created together would be born into a world that would never accept its existence, and she would have to face whatever came next without the strength of his presence, without the comfort of his touch, without even the knowledge of whether he lived or died. Standing in that empty room, Margaret Beaumont understood that her real education was just beginning. Everything she had learned about love and loss, about courage and consequence, about the price of defying a world built on cruelty, was merely preparation for what lay ahead. The child growing inside her was not just the product of forbidden love. It was proof that some truths refuse to stay hidden, that some loves demand acknowledgement regardless of cost, that some secrets grow too large for the spaces built to contain them. Dawn was still hours away, but Margaret could feel it coming like pressure in the air before a storm, and with it would come decisions that would define not just her future, but the future of the child who carried both her blood and Samuel's, both privilege and persecution, both the hope of love and the weight of a world determined to deny that such love could exist. She had chosen love over law once. Soon she would have to choose again. And this time the consequences would echo through generations, shaking the very foundations of everything Charleston believed about itself and the people it claimed to own. The morning came too soon, and brought with it the sound Margaret had been dreading. Footsteps in the hallway outside her room. Not the soft shuffle of servants going about their duties, but the heavy, deliberate tread of men with purpose. Her father's boots she recognized, and others she didn't. The measured pace of authority approaching with questions that demanded answers. She sat at her dressing table, hands steady as she pinned her hair into the elaborate style expected of a Beaumont daughter, watching her reflection practice the expression of innocent confusion she would need in the minutes to come. But beneath the careful composure, her mind raced through possibilities, each one darker than the last. Had they found Samuel? Had he been made to confess under interrogation? Had Viola finally gathered enough evidence to present her suspicions as facts? The knock came sharp and commanding. 3 precise raps that announced themselves as summons, not request. Margaret rose slowly, smoothed her skirts with hands that showed no tremor despite the earthquake happening beneath her ribs, and opened the door to find her father standing in the hallway, flanked by 2 men she recognized as overseers from neighboring plantations. Their faces carried the grim satisfaction of hunters who had cornered their prey. Colonel Edmund Beaumont stepped into her room without invitation, his eyes sweeping the space as if searching for evidence of crimes he already believed had been committed. Behind him, the overseers remained in the doorway, close enough to prevent escape, far enough to maintain the pretense that this was a family conversation rather than an interrogation. "Margaret," her father said, voice carrying the weight of disappointment and barely contained rage. "I believe we need to discuss certain rumors that have reached my attention. Rumors concerning your conduct and the company you've been keeping." She met his gaze without flinching, drawing on reserves of courage she hadn't known she possessed. "I'm afraid I don't understand what you mean, father. What rumors?" Edmund Beaumont's face darkened like storm clouds gathering force. He had built his fortune on reading people, on detecting weakness and exploiting it, on knowing when someone was lying to his face. But his daughter had learned from watching him navigate Charleston's treacherous social waters, had absorbed lessons in deception that now served her in ways he never intended. "Don't insult my intelligence, girl. The boy Samuel has been missing since yesterday evening, vanished without trace or explanation after serving this family faithfully for 3 years, and certain members of my household have expressed concerns about your frequent absences, your changed behavior, your apparent fascination with areas of this property where a lady has no business wandering." Margaret felt the trap closing around her like iron jaws, but kept her voice level, her expression puzzled rather than panicked. "Samuel, I barely knew him beyond seeing him tend the gardens. If he's run away, surely that's a matter for the authorities, not for me." One of the overseers stepped forward, a man named Garrett, whose reputation for brutality preceded him into every room he entered. His smile held no warmth, only the anticipation of violence that men like him wore like cologne. "Miss Beaumont, we've already spoken to several members of your household staff, including a young woman named Viola, who's been watching you quite carefully these past months. She's provided us with some very interesting observations about your activities." The words hit Margaret like physical blows, but she forced herself to remain standing, to keep breathing, to maintain the facade that was now her only protection. Viola had betrayed her, had gathered evidence and presented it to men who would use it to justify whatever punishment they deemed appropriate. The net she had felt tightening around her had finally closed, and she was trapped inside it with nowhere to run. "I'm sure Viola means well," Margaret replied carefully. "But I fail to see how the imaginings of an excitable servant girl constitute evidence of anything except her own tendency toward gossip." Edmund Beaumont moved closer, and Margaret could smell the whiskey on his breath, see the veins standing out on his forehead like rivers of fury. "The imaginings of a servant girl, is that what you call detailed accounts of your secret meetings in the carriage house? Your frequent disappearances during the afternoon hours when respectable women rest in their rooms? Your sudden need for looser clothing and your refusal to accept social invitations that would require you to appear in public?" Each accusation landed like a lash across her carefully constructed defenses. They knew everything, or enough to make the rest irrelevant. The meetings, the changed clothing, the subtle signs that pregnancy brought despite her efforts to conceal them. Margaret realized with crystalline clarity that denial would no longer serve her. The time for hiding was over. The moment for truth had arrived, whether she was ready for it or not. But before she could speak, before she could find words to navigate the impossible space between confession and continued deception, her mother appeared in the doorway. Elizabeth Beaumont stood framed by the morning light, her face pale as bone china, her hands clutched together as if holding pieces of herself that threatened to scatter like leaves in wind. "Edmund," Elizabeth said, voice barely above a whisper, "perhaps we should discuss this matter privately, in your study, away from servants who might overhear things that would be better kept within the family." The overseers exchanged glances, recognizing dismissal when they heard it, but Garrett lingered in the doorway as if reluctant to leave before the entertainment reached its climax. "Colonel Beaumont, if you'd prefer us to handle this matter in the traditional way, we're prepared to take whatever actions you deem necessary." Margaret understood the threat beneath those carefully chosen words. The traditional way meant violence, meant public punishment designed to serve as warning and example, meant death for Samuel if they found him, and shame beyond bearing for her family if the truth became public knowledge. But it also meant that her father still had choices, still had the power to contain the scandal, if he acted quickly and decisively. "I appreciate your offer, Garrett," Edmund replied slowly, "but this is a family matter that requires family solutions. I'll handle it from here." The overseers withdrew with obvious reluctance, leaving Margaret alone with her parents in a room that suddenly felt smaller than a coffin. The silence stretched between them like a blade, sharp enough to cut, heavy enough to crush. Outside the window, she could hear the normal sounds of morning on the plantation. Birds singing, horses snorting, the distant voices of field hands beginning their daily labor. Life continuing, as if the world hadn't just shifted on its axis. Elizabeth closed the door with careful precision, then turned to face her daughter with eyes that held more pain than anger. "Margaret," she said softly, "tell me it isn't true. Tell me that these accusations are nothing more than malicious gossip and servant jealousy." The plea in her mother's voice almost broke Margaret's resolve. Elizabeth Beaumont had spent her entire adult life maintaining the illusion that their world was civilized, that the wealth and comfort they enjoyed came from sources that didn't stain the soul. She had perfected the art of not seeing what she couldn't bear to acknowledge, of not hearing what she couldn't afford to understand. And now her daughter was about to destroy that carefully constructed blindness forever. Margaret looked at her mother, then at her father, and made the choice that would define the rest of her life. Not the choice between truth and lies. That decision had already been made for her by Viola's betrayal and her father's investigation, but the choice between cowering before judgment and standing tall despite it, between apologizing for love and defending it. "It's true," she said simply, voice steady as stone. "Every word of it is true." The admission hung in the air like smoke from cannon fire, acrid and impossible to ignore. Elizabeth gasped as if she'd been struck, one hand flying to her throat while the other groped for the nearest chair. Edmund's face went through several colours before settling on a shade of purple that suggested apoplexy might claim him before he could claim his revenge. "You admit it," he roared, spittle flying from his lips. "You admit to consorting with a slave, to debasing yourself and this family with behaviour so depraved that civilized society has no words for it." Margaret lifted her chin, meeting his fury with calm that seemed to enrage him further. "I admit to falling in love with a good man who happened to be born into circumstances beyond his control. I admit to finding in him qualities of character and intelligence that put to shame most of the so-called gentlemen of Charleston society. And I admit to carrying his child with more pride than shame." The last sentence detonated in the room like a bomb. Elizabeth made a sound that was part sob, part scream, and collapsed into the chair she had been seeking. Edmund staggered backward as if the words had physical weight, his face cycling through disbelief, horror, and rage so pure it seemed to burn the air around him. "A child," he whispered. Then louder. "A child? You're telling me that you're carrying the bastard spawn of a runaway slave?" "I'm telling you that I'm carrying the child of a man I love," Margaret replied evenly. "A child who will be born free because love recognizes no chains, acknowledges no masters, bows to no laws except those written in the human heart." Edmund Beaumont had built his empire on the belief that some people were born to rule and others to serve, that bloodlines determined worth, that the natural order of things could not be challenged without inviting chaos. His daughter's words didn't just contradict those beliefs, they declared war on them. And he responded as he had been trained to respond to any threat to his authority. His hand moved faster than thought, catching Margaret across the face with enough force to send her stumbling backward. The crack of palm against cheek echoed in the room like a gunshot, sharp and final. But Margaret didn't fall, didn't cry out, didn't crumble under the weight of his disapproval. Instead, she straightened, touched her fingers to the red mark blooming on her cheek, and looked at him with something that might have been pity. "Is that how you plan to solve this problem, Father? With violence? With the same brutality you've used to maintain your position all these years?" Edmund raised his hand again, but Elizabeth's voice stopped him. "Edmund, no. Not again. We need to think, need to plan. Striking her won't change what's already happened." He lowered his hand slowly, breathing hard, as if he'd been running. "What's already happened? What's already happened is that our daughter has destroyed this family's reputation, has thrown away everything I've built, has chosen to align herself with animals instead of her own kind." Margaret felt the child move inside her, responding to the tension in her body, the elevation in her heartbeat. She placed her hand protectively over her belly, and spoke with quiet conviction. He's not an animal. He's more human than most of the men you call friend, more honest than the politicians you buy, more gentle than the overseers you employ. And if carrying his child makes me an outcast from this society, then perhaps this society isn't worth belonging to. The words seemed to drain something from Edmund, leaving him looking older and more fragile than Margaret had ever seen him. He sank into a chair beside his wife, head in his hands, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of a man watching his world collapse. Do you understand what you've done? Do you have any comprehension of the consequences your actions will bring down on all of us? When word of this reaches Charleston society, we'll be ruined completely. No decent family will associate with us. No business will trade with us. We'll be pariahs in our own city, outcasts in our own social circle. Margaret had considered these consequences during the long nights when she lay awake feeling the child grow inside her, imagining the future that awaited them all. She had weighed the cost of her choices and found them worth paying. But seeing the devastation in her father's face, the broken despair in her mother's posture, she felt the full weight of what her love had demanded from everyone around her. "I understand the consequences," she said softly. "But I also understand that some things matter more than social standing. Some truths are worth whatever price they require." Edmund looked up at her with eyes that held no trace of the affection he had once shown his only child. "Truth? You call this degradation truth? You call this betrayal of everything decent and proper truth?" "I call love truth," Margaret replied. "I call the recognition of another person's humanity truth. I call the courage to follow your heart despite the world's disapproval truth. And yes, I call this child growing inside me truth, the most honest, most pure truth I've ever known." The room fell silent, except for Elizabeth's quiet weeping and the sound of Edmund's laboured breathing. Outside, the plantation continued its daily routine, unaware that the foundation of everything it represented was cracking apart in this small room where a young woman had chosen love over law, truth over comfort, courage over conformity. But Margaret knew that silence couldn't last forever. That soon, decisions would have to be made about her future, about the child's future, about how the Beaumont family would navigate the scandal that threatened to destroy them all. The easy choices were behind them now. What lay ahead would test every belief, challenge every assumption, and demand sacrifices that none of them had imagined they might be called upon to make. The child stirred again, as if sensing the importance of the moment, and Margaret smiled despite everything. Whatever came next, whatever price her love ultimately demanded, she would pay it gladly. Because some truths, once acknowledged, refuse to be denied. Some loves, once declared, demand to be defended. And some children, once conceived in hope and carried in courage, insist on being born into whatever world awaits them, even if that world had no place prepared for their existence. Even if that world would fight their every breath. Even if that world would never forgive the love that brought them into being. Margaret Beaumont had made her choice. Now she would live with the consequences, whatever they might be. The days that followed moved like molasses in winter, thick with unspoken threats and whispered consultations behind closed doors. Margaret remained confined to her room, meals brought by servants who wouldn't meet her eyes, her requests for books or paper denied. The house around her buzzed with activity that felt different from the usual rhythms of plantation life. Urgent conversations in the hallway outside her door, the sound of horses arriving at all hours, the rustle of papers being shuffled and signed in her father's study, her window. She watched. Through the world continue as if nothing had changed. Field hands bent over their tasks in the distance, their backs curved like question marks against the sky. Carriages rolled along the river road, carrying Charleston's elite to social gatherings, where her absence would soon be noticed and discussed. The gardens bloomed with autumn colours, The same paths where she had first fallen in love, now forbidden territory, guarded by men her father had hired to ensure she didn't attempt to flee. But Margaret wasn't planning to run. Where could she go, carrying a child whose very existence would mark her as outcast in any respectable society? What sanctuary existed for a woman who had crossed the most fundamental line her world had drawn? She had made her choice in that moment of confession, and now she would face whatever judgment that choice had earned. On the 4th day of her imprisonment, her mother finally visited. Elizabeth Beaumont entered the room like a ghost of herself, pale and thin, moving with the careful steps of someone who no longer trusted the ground beneath her feet. She carried a tea service on a silver tray, the same pattern they had used for afternoon visits since Margaret was a child. The familiar ritual felt surreal in the context of their new reality. Elizabeth set the tray on the small table by the window and began pouring with hands that shook slightly. The china rattled against itself, a delicate sound that seemed too fragile for the weight of what lay between them. Margaret watched her mother's face, searching for some sign of the woman who had once braided her hair and read her stories, but found only the hollow shell that grief and shock had left behind. "Your father has been meeting with lawyers," Elizabeth said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "and with certain gentlemen who handle delicate matters for families in our position." Margaret felt cold fingers of dread walk down her spine. She knew what kind of gentlemen her mother meant. Men who specialized in making problems disappear, who understood that sometimes preservation of reputation required actions that could never be spoken aloud. What kind of delicate matters? Elizabeth's hands stilled on the teapot. She stared into the amber liquid, as if it might hold answers to questions she couldn't bear to ask directly. There are places, Margaret, quiet places far from Charleston, where young women in difficult circumstances can wait out their troubles, where mistakes can be corrected and reputations preserved. The euphemisms fell like stones into still water, each one creating ripples of meaning that Margaret understood all too well. Places where inconvenient pregnancies could be ended, where evidence of indiscretion could be eliminated before it drew breath, where the Beaumont name could be scrubbed clean of its stain. "And after these mistakes are corrected?" Margaret asked, keeping her voice steady despite the horror crawling up her throat. "What happens then?" Elizabeth finally looked at her daughter, and Margaret saw tears tracking down her cheeks like silver scars. "Then you come home. You resume your place in society. You marry someone suitable who understands the value of discretion. You live the life you were meant to live, as if none of this ever happened." Margaret placed both hands over her belly, feeling the child move restlessly as if sensing the threat that circled them both. "And if I refuse?" The silence stretched between them like a chasm neither could bridge. Elizabeth set down the teapot with trembling fingers and looked out the window at the gardens where her daughter had first lost her way. When she spoke again, her voice carried the hollow ring of a woman reciting words that had been chosen for her. "Then you will be declared mentally unfit to manage your own affairs. You will be committed to an institution where you can receive the care and treatment necessary to restore your reason. Your child will be born there and placed immediately into the care of suitable families, and you will remain under medical supervision until such time as your condition improves sufficiently to allow your return to civilized society." Each word hit Margaret like a physical blow. She understood now what her father's lawyers and gentlemen had been planning, not just the elimination of her child, but the destruction of her will to resist. They would lock her away in some distant asylum, drug her into compliance, steal her baby before she could even hold it. They would erase her defiance as thoroughly as they planned to erase the evidence of her love. "There is no third option?" Margaret asked, though she already knew the answer. Elizabeth turned back to her daughter with eyes that held more pain than anger. "Your father loves you, Margaret. Despite everything, he loves you. But he loves this family's honor more. He loves the legacy he's built more. He won't allow one person's foolishness to destroy what 3 generations have created. Margaret stood and moved to the window, looking out at the landscape that had shaped her entire existence. The fields that stretched to the horizon, worked by people her family owned like livestock. The great house that stood as monument to their wealth and position. The gardens where she had discovered that love recognized no boundaries except those imposed by fear and hatred. All of it built on the belief that some people mattered more than others, that some lives had value while others existed only to serve. "What if I told you that I don't care about the family honor?" she said quietly. "What if I said that I'd rather lose everything than pretend this child doesn't deserve to live?" Elizabeth's reflection in the window showed a woman caught between love for her daughter and loyalty to everything she had been taught to value. "Then I would say that you're still too young to understand what you're throwing away, too naive to comprehend the full cost of your choices." Margaret turned from the window and looked at her mother with eyes that held no trace of the girl she had been 6 months before. The woman who stood there now had been forged in the fire of impossible choices, tempered by love that demanded everything and promised nothing in return. She had learned that some truths burned too bright to hide, that some loves refuse to bow before the altars of respectability, that some children insist on being born despite the world's determination to deny their right to exist. "Then perhaps," Margaret said softly, her hand resting on the life growing within her, "it's time this family learned what love is truly worth."